If you thought we were done with Metal Gear PSP spin-offs, boy would you be wrong. The team at Kojima Productions had been wanting to release some mainline handheld installments that they referred to as Metal Gear Solid chapters, and Kojima himself had been playing around with the idea of a new mainline game where you could recruit soldiers using a Wi-Fi connection. So while he and the main team were working on the then upcoming Metal Gear Solid 4, the Metal Gear Acid 2 team was put onto developing this idea into a reality. And in December 2006, Metal Gear Solid Portable Ops was released to the world. So, would the first mainline handheld title in the series turn out to be a success, or would it be held back by the platform it was developed for? Well, let's talk about it. And before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 11th in a series of videos where I'm playing every Metal Gear game for the first time and reviewing them as I go along in preparation for Metal Gear Delta. And while you don't have to have seen the rest of the videos in order to enjoy this one, you will be missing a lot of important context about my journey with the series if you haven't seen them. So I'll have the full playlist linked in the description below for those of you that want to go check those out first. But with that out of the way, Metal Gear Solid Portable Ops is an action-adventure stealth game developed by Kojima Productions and published by Konami for the PlayStation Portable in 2006. And before we can really get into the game itself, we need to talk about the big question. Is it canon? Well, with this one, it's kind of hard to answer. When looking back on the development history of the game, it was considered mainline and canon at the time of its development and release, with Kojima even waiting to finish the script for Metal Gear Solid 4 until the Portable Ops team had finished their script to make sure that he didn't conflict with anything being done with this game and even to be able to throw in some references to it. But years later, Kojima also said in an interview that any game he directed in the franchise should be considered mainline, and anything that he didn't should be considered a spin-off, which would mean that Portable Ops would no longer be canon. From where I'm sitting, I'm going to treat the game as mainline until anything in a later title prompts me to change my mind, as that was the intent when the game was originally developed and released, and it's completely possible that when Kojima said that in that interview, he just simply overlooked Portable Ops. Anyway, the game opens 6 years after the events of Metal Gear Solid 3, with Big Boss having been captured and held prisoner by renegade members of the US Special Forces Unit Fox in a Colombian prison. We're interrogated by a man named Cunningham, a member of Fox and their interrogation specialist in our cell, with him telling us that the CIA only managed to recover half of the Philosopher's legacy and asking us where the other half is, as they believe that we would know where it would be. Big Boss says that he doesn't know what he's talking about, and Cunningham eventually gives up and leaves for the time being, and shortly after, we take the opportunity to escape through a vent in our cell, with another prisoner filling us in on what's happening. He tells us that we're in the San Geronimo Peninsula just off the coast of Colombia, also telling us that the Red Army is in control of the island. He explains that the Soviets built the base in secret after the Cuban Missile Crisis in order to maintain a missile launch facility within range of the United States, but apparently the plans for the base were canceled before construction was ever finished. The prisoner and the rest of the soldiers that came with him were sent in to investigate, but when they got there, they were ambushed by the Fox unit, killing all members of his team other than him. Big Boss tells the prisoner to call him Snake, and he introduces himself to us as Roy Campbell before we go to find a way to call in a rescue. Here, we get our first real stretch of gameplay, and the first thing that I have to talk about is that frame rate. When developing Portable Ops, the team got the MGS3 engine running on the PSP, something that we'll come back to in a minute, but due to the difficulties of porting a full console engine straight over to the handheld, the game is capped at a glorious 20 frames per second. Now, for anyone who hasn't played a game capped at less than 30 FPS before, this might not look so bad, but if you've ever played something that runs this poorly, like maybe Ocarina of Time on the N64 back in the day, you know how genuinely awful it feels. Along with just looking really choppy, it also means that the game feels much clunkier to control than it would otherwise, as you're only getting a small portion of the on-screen feedback that you would expect from other games. Thankfully, when you're just watching the gameplay, 20 FPS doesn't look too bad, so for the sake of this video, it isn't the most important thing, but if you ever plan to play this for yourself, just know going in that the frame rate is pretty rough. Technical aspects aside though, the core gameplay here is basically pulled straight over from Metal Gear Solid 3's Subsistence. This means that everything you would expect from MGS3 is here, from the movement to the CQC, and the freely controlled camera from the Subsistence release was also brought over, meaning that you don't have the awkward camera problems that the original MGS3 Snake Eater release had. One major change here though is that all of the pausing the game to swap camos, heal yourself, eat food, or manage your backpack has been removed here. The camo and the food systems are completely absent, the game has gone back to using a universal healing item that simply increases your health, and the inventory system is completely different from anything the franchise has had before. In Portable Ops, you can only carry 4 items and weapons at a time, but you can drop and pick up whatever you want as you go along using the selection menu. This might sound like a major downgrade at first, but as we'll come back to in a bit, other systems present in this game actually make this change super enjoyable. Another change you might notice is that the guards in this game have one of the craziest cases of tunnel vision we've ever seen in a 3D Metal Gear. There are a lot of moments where it seems like an enemy should clearly be able to see you, but they simply don't, as unless you're pretty close to them and standing directly in front of them, they just won't see you. If I had to guess, I'm assuming that the enemy awareness has been dulled down compared to previous Metal Gear games to make up for the fact that playing this on the PSP's controls is pretty awkward, and on top of the low frame rate, can lead to some pretty easy misinputs, so they've made sneaking around guards a little easier to compensate for that. I don't really feel like the reduced awareness of the guards here really adds to or takes away from the game overall, it's just something kind of funny that I thought was worth a mention here. The gameplay overall generally feels solid, but if I had to pick one thing that makes it feel worse than anything else, I would have to say that it's actually the camera. There's already the problems coming over from the low frame rate, with the camera feeling really choppy and like it has a bit of input lag on it, but it's also just way too tight for some areas in this game. This game has a ton of interior areas that are barely large enough to fit Snake in them, and in these areas, it becomes incredibly difficult to actually see where you're going and keep some sense of spatial awareness. Along with that, I haven't played the Subsistence version of MGS3 yet, so I'm not sure if this problem is unique to Portable Ops or carried over from that game, but the camera will automatically turn towards where Snake is facing and moving, meaning that you can't freely control the camera and move at the same time. There are plenty of instances in this game where I might want to keep an eye on a guard while sneaking by them, or maybe peek around a corner as I round the turn, and you can do that for about a second or so, but then the camera will start to actively fight back and pull around to look in front of Snake again. It makes something as basic as looking and moving at the same time feel incredibly frustrating and inconvenient, and it's another thing that you should be aware of going in if you plan to play this game for yourself. Anyway, we eventually reach the communications building of the compound, getting into contact with Paramedic from MGS3. Snake asks her if he can talk to Major Zero, and she tells us that Major Zero was arrested by military police about a month ago under suspicion of treason. She explains that the CIA's Fox unit stole a top secret weapon from the US, and that he's been charged with instigating the rebellion, and that we've actually been charged as well. She puts us into contact with Sigint, also returning from MGS3, who tells us that we should try to convince some of the Russian soldiers who are stationed there to work for us instead of the Fox unit, as having more men on our side would make our life a lot easier. He also tells us that the US sent some Green Berets into the country for recon, but that they lost contact with them nearby, and if we manage to find them, we might be able to convince them to help us out. Hearing this, Snake goes back to Campbell, freeing him from his cell, filling him in on the whole situation, and convincing him to help us out. He tells us that there's a patrol base nearby, and that we should go there to try to gather some intel. We get there, and we overhear a couple of the guards talking about how they're storing some sort of weapon that packs enough firepower to wipe out the entirety of Russia, and wondering what it might be that they're actually storing. We recover some secret documents there, and when we bring them back to Campbell, we find out that the enemy plans on using whatever new weapon they have against both the US and Russia, despite the fact that they're currently in negotiations with both of them. We also learn that the enemy's commander is named Gene before we get moving again to continue the mission. Shortly after, we attempt to capture an enemy guard to turn him to our side, and once we've abducted one, he explains to us that the Soviet soldiers aren't working with Fox because they were threatened, but because Russia betrayed them first. After all the work the soldiers had done to build and maintain the base, Russia decided to wipe the base off the records to avoid any sort of political fallout from the US potentially discovering it, wiping the records of all soldiers involved and cutting the men off from their homeland, leaving them stranded in Colombia. Snake explains to the guard that soldiers need to be loyal to themselves above all others and find their own reason to fight, convincing him to join our cause and work with us from this point on. This soldier's name is Jonathan, and you better remember it as he will be coming up again later in the video. And this brings us to a new idea that Portable Ops introduces to the series, with us being able to capture and turn soldiers from around the base to our side. Anytime you knock a soldier out during a mission, you can bring them back to the truck you drove in on, abducting them for reconditioning in the hopes that they'll join your ranks. The soldiers that do end up joining you can then be assigned to your sneaking unit, allowing us to play as them while out on missions. Each soldier that you turn to your side also has a chance to have unique perks, such as being able to drag bodies much faster, being able to instantly deliver items back to base, or simply just having a faster running speed than other soldiers. And our main man Jonathan was actually in my squad for the majority of the game since he was able to drag bodies much faster than the other soldiers, though he did have this uncomfortable habit to handle the unconscious soldiers the same way I handled your mom last night. And remember earlier when I said that some of the systems in this game actually make the inventory limit fun? Well, the soldier system is the main thing I was referring to. If you bring an item back from a mission, you can then remove it from your inventory and put it into storage, allowing you to just have it on hand for any later mission you might want it for. Along with this, as I mentioned, some soldiers that you capture will have the delivery man skill, allowing them to instantly send an item back to storage while out in the field. This means that even though there's a strict inventory limit per character, players who plan things out ahead of time will actually be heavily rewarded in this game, and I really enjoyed retrieving an item in the field with one soldier, but then giving it to another one who would actually get more benefit out of it. Getting back to the story though, Campbell has been coughing ever since we freed him from his cell and getting progressively worse, and Jonathan mentions that he seems to be showing signs of malaria, so we need to find some medication that will treat his symptoms before things get really bad. We go to the hospital on the base, finding their shipment manifest, but it turns out that all the recent shipments have actually been going to a nearby research lab instead of getting delivered to the hospital. So if we want to have any chance of curing Campbell, we need to go there instead. And around this point in the game, it hit me that the level design here in Portable Ops is actually pretty good. Sure, I mentioned earlier that the interior areas feel pretty claustrophobic, and the camera in this game certainly doesn't help with that, but the majority of areas you'll visit have really interesting designs and layouts. Even with the clunky controls and camera, I really enjoyed exploring the various areas of the San Geronimo Peninsula, and the designers who worked on Portable Ops should be commended for managing to create such interesting and varied environments while working within the constraints of the PSP. As we move forward towards the research lab, we hear some of the Fox members speaking with scientists about someone who needs to be awoken from a culture tank. They're told that it will take at least another 12 hours before he's ready, before some steel beams fall near them, and one of the Fox members remarks that fate would never allow him to be hurt. He then gives a speech to all the soldiers working on the construction nearby, inspiring them to work even harder, leading Snake to realize that the man speaking must be Gene. We go to find the culture tank that they were speaking of, and when we do, we're spotted by a female scientist who tells us to hide in a locker before some guards arrive. She plays it off with the guards, telling them it's just her in there, and after they leave, she introduces herself as Eliza. She tells us that her sister Ursula is a member of the Fox unit, explaining to us that Ursula is one of the most powerful psychics in the world. We ask her who the man in the tube is, with her telling us that his codename is Null, and that he's the only surviving member of the now cancelled Perfect Soldier program. She hands us some medicine to treat the local strain of malaria, and tells us to head for the harbor to find what we're looking for. There is one issue though, and that is that we don't know where the harbor is or how to get to it. So we go out searching for information on it, and while doing so, I was met with a pretty wild wake-up call. So you see this slimmer bar next to my health in the lower left corner? Well, this is the stamina bar in this game, but the catch is, the food items that were present in MGS3 aren't in Portable Ops. So how do you restore your stamina, I hear you ask? Well, you eat rations. Simple enough, right? But you see, when I saw the various rations lying around, I initially thought that they were a generic healing item once again like they were in every Metal Gear game before MGS3. I was also finding items called medical supplies, and I, for whatever reason, assumed that these were another generic healing item that just restored more health than the rations. And before anyone says it, yes, I'm incredibly stupid for just assuming this without ever actually using a ration, but this did lead to a pretty hilarious moment during my playthrough. At about this point in my run, I ran out of stamina entirely for the first time, which led to Snake instantly falling over and dying. So I found myself in a spot where I had to go and find some leads on where the harbor is, but while doing so, I was also frantically running around looking for rations just to stay alive. Another thing that I realized during this search is that the tranquilizer pistol in this game is comically overpowered. Now, this isn't the first time that a tranq gun has destroyed the balance of a Metal Gear Solid title, but if you ask me, this is probably the most damage it's done to the balance of any single game. Obviously, the tranq pistol is always an incredibly powerful option for being able to silently and instantly knock out a guard from range, but what if that pistol now had infinite ammo? That's right, here in Portable Ops, your tranquilizer gun now has effectively infinite ammo, as well as effectively infinite suppressor durability, making it an even stronger tool than it has ever been before. Now, I say effectively because it is theoretically possible to run out of ammo or break the suppressor, but due to the way that Portable Ops works as a game, you'll start every single mission with full ammo and suppressor durability on all of your weapons. So while the ammo isn't actually infinite, you do get at least 40 shots in this thing per mission, and while I ended up using this weapon to take out almost every single guard I encountered in the game, I never once ran out of ammo or broke the suppressor on it. Anyway, after searching for info on the harbor for a little bit and yielding no results, I decided to send some spies out to gather the info for me. And this brings us into one of the more interesting parts of the soldier system, that being the spy system. Instead of assigning soldiers to the sneaking units and controlling them manually, you can instead send them out to go and gather information from a specific area of the San Jeronimo Peninsula. Your spies will then alert you to a number of things, from where the enemy is holding prisoners that you could recruit, what areas have new weapons that you haven't found yet, and even giving you intel on supply caches that you can then go and destroy in order to weaken the enemy throughout the island. All of these things are totally optional if you want to just blast through the main story, but these offer a ton of rewarding side content, giving you very good reasons to revisit areas from earlier in the game and become more familiar with the base as a whole. I personally ended up going after almost every piece of side content that my spies told me about, not because I was forcing myself to 100% the game or anything, but because all of these leads had genuinely good rewards for the rest of the game if completed, and it leads to the spy system actually being one of my favorite parts of the game. Anyway, our spies eventually managed to find out where the harbor is, so we make our way over to it, and while there, we come across a man who is able to turn things into ice by simply touching them, who also says that he was hoping to find his old friend Snake lurking about. Snake calls the man Python under his breath, remarking at the fact that he's still alive. Python leaves, and we go over to talk to a prisoner of his, Colonel Skoronsky of the Red Army, who explains to us that after Gene arrived, it took him less than 4 weeks to bring the entire peninsula under his control, and he tells us that Gene turned the Red Army soldiers to his side using fear. The Colonel seems to be a little on the crazy side, so we leave him in the cell, moving on to see what else might be around the harbor. In the bottom of a cargo ship there, we also find a large crate marked Made in USA, with Snake telling Campbell that that crate must be what the prototype weapon was moved in. Snake also notes that they seemingly moved the prototype off the ship already, but that there are spare weapon and armor pieces laying all over the place. Campbell is confused, saying that if it's a weapon that could hit every major city in Russia, it would have to be ballistic and it would be weird for there to be armor pieces laying around. But Snake tells him that with what he's seeing, he's certain that it's a land-based weapon of some kind. Immediately after this, we get a call from a mysterious voice who thanks us for taking care of Colonel Volgin back in Grozny Grad and tells us to call him Privodenie, the Russian word for ghost that I definitely pronounced flawlessly. The ghost asks us if we remember the Shagohod, leading Snake to realize that the prototype weapon here must be a similar sort of nuclear-equipped tank. Ghost confirms that America was working on making their own version of the Shagohod, but explains that this tank is a bipedal walking tank instead of being tread-based, and that it has a much more powerful booster than the Shagohod did as well. Snake recalls Granin's Metal Gear plans that were in development back in Selenoyarsk, and decides that we need to destroy the nuclear storage facility on the base to prevent Metal Gear from firing, so we go off to find out where the warheads are being stored. Shortly after this, I get word from one of my spy units that the map to the nuclear storage facility is in a nearby security base, so we go there to grab it. And while there, I decided to get into my first all-out gunfight of the game, and I learned that the new Ready Weapon button also works as an auto-aim tool while in third person. This might sound like a dumb change to cater to more casual players, but if you've ever actually played on a PSP, you know that those controls could be really rough to do anything overly precise with, so it's simply something that makes the game feel more playable and allows the general pace of the gameplay to be on par with that of a proper home console entry in the series. Along with that, you can now press the circle button while aiming to manually reload whenever you want, which, while not any better than simply using the quick equip button to holster and equip the weapon again, it is fun to trigger the full reload animation, and just something that I thought deserved a little mention here. Getting back on track though, we eventually arrive at the nuclear storage facility. Our spies told us that the warheads were on their way there and hadn't arrived yet, so we try to blow up the machines powering the elevator before we're confronted by Python, who reveals that he froze the detonator on our bomb, preventing us from being able to actually blow it up. Snake asks how he survived the incident in Vietnam, with him explaining that due to the wounds that he suffered, his body lost its ability to regulate its own temperature, so he was put in a special liquid nitrogen suit to keep him alive, which has now made him an even better soldier than he ever was before. He then reveals that he was appointed to the Fox unit for the CIA to become a soldier even better than Snake himself, so that if Big Boss ever decided to betray the US, Python would be ready to kill him. He says that after killing us, his purpose will be fulfilled, leading us into the first boss fight of the game. In this fight, the entire room has been filled with liquid nitrogen, clouding up the place and making it hard to keep track of Python as he moves around. So in order to defeat him, we have to play a game of cat and mouse, luring him out into gunfire before retreating back into the fog to set up another trap for him. And hilariously, during my fight with him, Snake actually died because of my skill issue, so I had to bring our boy Jonathan in to clean up the mess after Big Boss himself couldn't. After we defeat Python, he tells us that soldiers can't find purpose in the good of a nation or the hatred of an enemy, and that they can only find their salvation in the hands of a hero that will lead them to it. He asks if Snake can bring his men to their salvation before dying on the floor in front of us. Afterwards, Campbell tells us that while we were fighting Python, the nukes were delivered to their destination, and that our objective now has to shift to destroying Metal Gear itself. One of our spy units then informs us that a government official is hanging out at a nearby airport, so I go to interrogate him, and he just so happens to give up the location of the nuclear missile silo. We go to the silo, where we run into Null, the perfect soldier from earlier, leading us into another boss fight. Due to Null's enhanced reflexes and techniques, we can't attack him head on, needing to either catch him by surprise or use things like claymores to set up traps for him. After we defeat him, Snake realizes that he's seen Null before we're surrounded by guards and subsequently captured. And this actually brings us to a pretty interesting point in the game, where with Snake captured, Campbell and the rest of the men we've gathered have to figure out where we've been taken and put together a plan to free us, meaning that we have to go around seeking information without Snake being playable. And I know that a lot of Metal Gear fans just want to play as Snake in these games, but there's something weirdly special about playing as your own recruits in this game, and since all of them have their own unique strengths and weaknesses, this part of the game makes the stealth even deeper since you have to bring the right man for the job depending on what exactly you're trying to do. For example, if you're trying to go out and interrogate soldiers for information, you're going to need to bring someone who specializes in CQC, as the majority of the men you gather either won't be able to use it, or will only be able to use the very basic functions of it. Eventually though, I interrogate an officer who tells me that Snake has been taken to the guest house, giving us the lead we've been looking for. We then cut to Cunningham and Gene talking about how they're going to interrogate us, with Gene telling Cunningham to make sure that he figures out where the remainder of the legacy is. Cunningham leaves the room for a bit, and Gene asks Snake why he's back on the battlefield. Snake doesn't have an answer, and Gene says that it's simply his warrior instinct that brought him back, as once someone has been on the battlefield, they can never return to a normal life. And I absolutely loved this scene as we get to see the seeds of this ideology being planted in Big Boss, while already knowing that he will eventually pass this exact ideology down to Solid Snake in Metal Gear 2. Gene then explains to Snake that the whole story about stealing Metal Gear was a setup from the beginning. The CIA was planning to give Metal Gear over to the Soviet Union in order to prolong the Cold War, as Russia's economy is in shambles, and the CIA recognizes that if the Cold War ended, they would quickly become unimportant and lose the majority of their funding as well. The CIA ordered the Fox unit to steal Metal Gear and pretend to defect to the Soviet Union, and they've simply been following orders this entire time. He then explains to us that he's the result of the Successor Project, a top-secret program that was meant to create the perfect battlefield commander, with Gene having been molded by the techniques of the legendary boss herself. And as our men keep trying to find someone with information on the exact location of the guest house, we get another cutscene with Gene talking on the phone with his contact at the CIA, revealing that he's working with Ocelot. Null then comes in, killing multiple soldiers and telling Gene that his mission isn't complete until Snake is dead. He tries to attack Gene, but Gene swiftly deals with him, having the guards take him away to reset his memory before redeploying him. I eventually find someone who knows where the guest house is, and we get yet another cutaway with Eliza from earlier visiting Snake's cell and telling him that Gene is working on loading the nuclear warheads into Metal Gear. She reveals that she saw a vision of Snake destroying Metal Gear, and says that while her premonitions don't always come true, she believes that this one will. Campbell and the rest of the men stage a rescue operation to free Snake, but on the way out with him, we're confronted by Cunningham, who asks us again where the legacy is. Snake tells him that he doesn't know, but Cunningham is insistent, saying that the Pentagon told him that we stole the KGB's half. Then all of a sudden, Eliza flies in a truck to save us, allowing Snake to finally escape. She takes Snake to show him where Metal Gear is being held, and along the way, she explains that she and her sister Ursula gained their psychic abilities after being exposed to an accidental nuclear blast at a nearby research facility when they were young. She tells Snake that she's helping him because she feels that he'll be a great father someday, which is ironic, to say the least. She also tells us that even though she's never seen Gene fight, she believes that his reflexes and skills might surpass even Null's. With Snake back in action, we go to destroy Metal Gear, but as we come face to face with it, Gene and his men ambush us, and Metal Gear is activated. The colonel from the prison cell earlier is the one piloting it, and Snake believes that this was Gene's plan all along, but he apparently never meant for him to escape and pilot Metal Gear. Gene then plays his real trump card, telling Ursula to wake up, revealing that Ursula and Eliza were originally one personality, and that the two of them actually live within the same body, turning Eliza on us by bringing out her alter ego. Ursula then flies into Metal Gear, and we get a Metal Gear fight reminiscent of Metal Gear 1's, where we need to plant TNT on the legs of Metal Gear to damage it. And once the legs have been destroyed, Metal Gear tips over, and we need to wait for the missile pods to open, hitting those since they're underneath the armor. And once again, Big Boss himself wasn't enough to handle this one, and we had to bring out Ol' Handsy Johnny to get the job done. Once we bring it down, Eliza is unfortunately killed in the explosion, and Gene says that he can see why Snake would catch Ocelot's eye. Sokolov from MGS3 then runs into the room, with Snake realizing that he's the ghost who's been calling us, and he reveals that we only destroyed the Metal Gear that they used for test exercises, and that the real weapon is still intact. Sokolov tells Gene that he couldn't stand to see his creation turned against his own motherland, and we see Metal Gear being flown out, confirming that what Sokolov said was true. Gene then gives a speech to his men, saying that neither the US or the Soviet Union can control them now, and that they're going to tear the nuclear weapons from the large world powers and spread them throughout the globe, plunging the world into a constant state of war and conflict. He then sows the seeds of doubt among his soldiers, saying that one of them has been ordered to kill the rest of them, putting fear into their hearts until they start blindly firing on one another in their distrust, with Jonathan jumping in to defend us from stray bullets, getting himself tragically killed in the process. Gene disappears, and we're left to find where they've brought the new Metal Gear. Our spies manage to get us the location of the underground facility it's being held in, but there's an impenetrable gate that runs on electricity preventing us from actually entering. So we go to the nearby power substation, planting a timed bomb on the power supply so that we can get in position to infiltrate the facility when it goes off. On our way back to the truck though, we run into Null again, who escaped before having his memory reset. Snake tells Null that 4 years ago, he ran into a child soldier in Mozambique who was killing enemies with nothing but a knife, and that child's name was Frank Yeager, revealing to us that Null has actually been Gray Fox this entire time, as well as jogging Null's memory in regards to his true identity. We battle him again, and afterwards, Snake apologizes to him, saying that he thought he would be safe at the rehab facility, and that the philosophers must have pulled some strings to get him back into military hands again. We go to infiltrate the underground facility, taking Frank with us to ensure that he remains safe. We fight our way through the guards defending the entrance, and once inside, we sneak our way through the complex, eventually running into Cunningham again. He explains to us that he doesn't answer to Gene or the Fox unit, but that his employer is actually the United States Department of Defense. He tells us that if Gene were to fire Metal Gear into the Soviet Union, the CIA wouldn't be as necessary in an actual war scenario, and all of their funding would go to the military instead. The Department of Defense orchestrated Big Boss being there so that someone would infiltrate the compound and start a rebellion against Gene's men, and give him no other option than to fire Metal Gear at the Soviet Union. And in classic Metal Gear fashion, we played right into their hands without knowing. Cunningham tells us that he won't be letting us through, leading into a boss fight against him. His fight is probably the simplest of all the bosses in the game, with us simply needing to shoot his hovercraft until it malfunctions, then shoot Gene himself while he's closer to the ground in order to actually kill him. It's not all that interesting, but I would be lying if I said it isn't a fun fight just for the spectacle, and the fact that it finally gives us a real chance to just unload with our M63. Once defeated, Cunningham self-destructs his hovercraft to try to take us with him, but we manage to escape the blast, moving forward to destroy Metal Gear for real this time. Once we reach the hangar, we encounter Gene, who says that he's known everything the entire time. The Pentagon's plans, Cunningham's real goals, everything. He tells us that his real target isn't Russia, but it's instead the CIA headquarters in Virginia, which he hopes that destroying will plunge the US into chaos and cause a shift in the global balance of power in order to get rid of the philosophers for good and start his own military nation in which soldiers can thrive, which he calls Army's Heaven. Snake tells him that he's building a country on fear and not for any care for or loyalty from his men, and that the real soldier's paradise would be found outside his heaven. Gene then reveals that Volgin launching the nuke back in the Virtuous mission, the boss's death, and Operation Snake Eater as a whole was all a setup from someone behind the scenes, telling Snake that his country can't save him and offering Snake a place alongside him. Snake refuses, so he presses the launch button for Metal Gear, but the launch is suddenly stopped and Ursula appears, revealing that she sabotaged Metal Gear in order to stop Gene's plans. Gene quickly stabs her in the chest and goes into the other room to activate the backup launch sequence. Ursula tells us of visions that she has while she's dying, saying that Snake will destroy Metal Gear only to build another one in its place, and that his son will bring the world to ruin before bleeding out in Snake's arms. We chase Gene into the next room, getting into a boss fight against him. He uses his enhanced reflexes to avoid most of our attacks, but every once in a while, he'll go for an attack that's taxing enough on his body that he needs to recover afterwards, allowing us to get some damage in. Again, it's a very basic fight, but it's fairly entertaining for what it is. After defeating him, he admits that we must be the true successor to the boss, with Snake asking him how to stop the launch. He tells us that once the countdown has been started, it can't be stopped, before tossing us a film saying that it contains all of the funding that he's pulled together for his Army's Heaven, saying that we'll need it one day when we eventually have the same dream as him. He tells Snake to go forth and find his own calling before bleeding out on the floor. Snake then gets a call from Sokolov, who tells us that even though the controls have been locked, it can be stopped if Snake dismantles the Metal Gear unit before the launch. Snake runs into the silo, firing an RPG at the Metal Gear unit, but it has no effect. And just when it seems like it's all over, all the men we've recruited throughout the game run in, all firing their weapons at the unit simultaneously, and when the missile does launch, the unit fails to deploy the nukes once in orbit, meaning that we very narrowly managed to avoid the disaster. We then cut to Ocelot confronting the director of the CIA on his way to the nuclear shelter, as they aren't aware the warhead deployment failed yet, with the director explaining that he's arriving late to the shelter because he had to retrieve all the data on the philosophers to ensure that they don't lose it. Ocelot tells him that that's perfect, shooting the director's armed escorts, revealing to him that he plans on retaking the other half of the legacy before he shoots the director, and the screen cuts to black. We then get one final conversation between Big Boss and Campbell, with Boss telling him that he now realizes that he's not living unless he's on the battlefield, and that he has to find his own reason to fight again before the credits roll. And of course, as this was meant to be a mainline Metal Gear title, we do get one last post-credits scene. We hear Ocelot pick up the phone, saying that they've framed the director's death as a suicide brought on by the guilt of his involvement with Metal Gear. He says that they should have known Gene was serious about launching those nukes, and now that he has the legacy, he asks the caller if that was all part of their plans as well. He admires their work in setting all this up, but tells them that they won't be using him anymore. The caller then says something about creating the perfect soldier and genes, and Ocelot says that he's willing to help them out with the project, but only on the condition that they get Big Boss involved as well, before hanging up. And now, I hope that some of you guys who weren't familiar with Portable Ops' narrative coming into this video can see why I say that I would consider it to be canon, at least given the perspective that I currently have on the franchise as a whole. I absolutely love how it clearly bridges the gap between the events of MGS3 and Big Boss's eventual establishing of Outer Heaven. While Metal Gear Solid 3's events would have broken Snake's trust in the United States government, Portable Ops' event would have planted the idea in his mind that he might be able to establish his own nation to care for and provide for other disillusioned soldiers like himself. And I especially love how Ursula says something in passing about Big Boss's son bringing the world to ruin, building even more suspense for the eventual release of Metal Gear Solid 4. I know that fans are pretty split on whether this title can be considered canon or not, and I'm sure that there are perfectly good reasons that people believe that it can't be, but from where I'm sitting, it seems like a fantastic addition to the overall narrative of the mainline games. And as I said at the start of the video, if things in later games start to conflict with things from Portable Ops, then I'll absolutely be bringing it up and giving my updated thoughts as that happens. Overall though, I was very surprised by how much I enjoyed Portable Ops. I hadn't heard great things before sitting down to play it for myself, and especially near the start of the game with the clunky controls and poor frame rate, I was fully expecting that this one just wouldn't be for me. But between the unique take on the 3D Metal Gear gameplay and the story that not only directly follows up MGS3, but also directly sets up the original Metal Gear, I found myself having a really good time with this one. It definitely has its issues, and I certainly wouldn't say it's as good as games like MGS 1, 2, and 3, but it really does have a lot to fall in love with. I can imagine that a lot of players won't enjoy the soldier system as much as I did, and I'm sure a lot will quit the game pretty early on due to the technical issues, but for those who can power through those aspects of the game, you'll find yourself weirdly addicted to this unusual little PSP title. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give Metal Gear Solid Portable Ops a 7.8. Hey guys, thanks for watching. If you want to check out my other Metal Gear reviews, you can find them right here. And if you want to catch more videos like this, click that subscribe button, even though that doesn't really mean much anymore. I also want to thank the incredible people who support me on Patreon. You guys allow me to put all this time into these videos, and I can't thank you guys enough. Well guys, I'll hope to catch all of you back here for the next Metal Gear review.